I'm going to explore is the way in which the notion of cultural diversity in Britain has been debated and mobilised in the wider social and political context of the past 50 years or so. I hope I'm not going to go over ground that's very familiar to you all. I'm going to be galloping through at a rate to try and cover the way that those debates have raised themselves over the past 50 years, so I hope you can follow. That Britain is a culturally diverse society is today indisputable reality. Of course, to some extent or another, Britain has always been socially, ethnically and culturally diverse. But this diversity has been considerably accelerated in the post-war period by some key historical processes. To start with, there's been the significant and visible immigration from the new Commonwealth countries, primarily of Africa, South Asia and the Caribbean. And this, together with entry into Europe and globalisation processes, has brought about a sea change in society from days when early migrants in the post-war period were met with notices such as no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Now, as the Paret report on the future of multi-ethnic Britain notes, England, Scotland and Wales are multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multicultural, multi-community societies. To give but a few examples, in some local areas of Britain, over 60% of the population is from minority communities. Mixed race relationships are amongst the highest in the world. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the UK. And Indian food has a higher turnover than coal, steel and shipbuilding combined. More and more people have multiple identities, such as Glaswegian Muslims, English Jews, Black British. And London itself is among the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. It has 300 languages, 50 non-indigenous communities with populations of 10,000 or more, with virtually every nation, culture and religion in the world able to claim at least a handful of Londoners. Almost a third of the city's residents were born outside Britain, some 2.2 million to be exact, with many tens of thousands more who are second or third generation immigrants. And this diversity isn't just confined to London. Some 53% of ethnic minority groups live outside London. Nevertheless, over the course of the past 40 years, ever since Enoch Powell's incendiary speech of 1968, in which he prophesied that in this country, quote, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man, a consistent nationalist discourse has been articulated by prominent right and new right politicians and writers, echoed by the popular press, which has given expression to public anxiety here about post-war migrants to Britain, in terms of the threat supposedly posed to the core values of British culture by the different cultures of those immigrants. This theme was pressed into service again in Margaret Thatcher's 1978 speech on World in Action, when she expressed her empathy with the fears of British people that, quote, this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. A sentiment given further voice in 1990 by one of her ministers, Norman Tebbit, when he argued for his infamous cricket test to be the measure of Britishness. Most recently, we find the arguments being made, but this time in the liberal discourse of David Goodhart's article entitled Too Diverse in Prospect magazine in February of 2004. Goodhart argues that culture and ethnic diversity is weakening Britain's social solidarity and the welfare state. He writes, as Britain becomes more diverse, that common culture is being eroded. As examples of this theme in the popular press, consider the following quotes. Minute Marin, writing in the Telegraph about Damiola Taylor's murder in Peckham, opines, into Peckham has been thrown a hugely various collection of people from all over the world, from all kinds of cultures, speaking tens of different languages. The place has been turned into a monstrous Tower of Babel, with a ceaseless, incoherent yammering, speaking only of mistrust and misunderstanding. How can there be any community? And here's Richard Littlejohn in an article in The Sun in 1999, in which he argues that the English are no longer able to feel at home in their own country, stressing that, to quote him, no one ever voted for a multicultural society. In sum, the argument of the nationalists is that Britain has too many immigrants of different cultures, and that the more diversity that our society is faced with, the less likely it is that people living here can share the so-called core values of British culture, and the more likely it is that, in the most recent terminology, they will exceed British thresholds of tolerance. This, they intimate, will lead to the breakdown of civil society. And in most recent times, of course, they see this danger as being exemplified by the terrorist threat from politicised Islam, now the enemy within. To put it simply then, in this argument, cultural diversity has become cultural difference, and cultural difference has become a threat to what are the, quote, core values of British culture. Against these discourses, of course, we have the historical reality of British society in the post-war period, a period in which Britain, faced like most Western European countries with a chronic shortage of labour, turned to its colonies to provide the labour it required in order to rebuild and maintain its social institutions and public services. As late as 1964, Enoch Powell himself referred to the need for a regulation of labour to fill areas of labour shortage in the economy, and was responsible as Minister of Health for actively encouraging the recruitment of nurses and doctors from the new Commonwealth countries into the health service. Britain, in fact, has always imported labour to meet the needs of its industrial economy. In the last couple of weeks alone, the government has talked about legislating to bring in new migrant labour to service the needs of employers in certain parts of the country, which have become acute as a result of an ageing population and increasing social mobility. Now, since the first post-war arrivals from the new Commonwealth, a variety of national policies and strategies have been deployed to address the presence of what was for the first time significant numbers of Asian and Black immigrants into this society. Initially, policy was dominated by the hope of assimilation. Britain was assumed to have a homogeneous majority culture into which the immigrants were expected to assimilate unproblematically, by leaving behind their languages and cultures of origin, and adopting those of the host society, a society which was conceived of as being essentially tolerant. As, however, by the late 1960s, assimilationist policies and practices came under increasing criticism, not least from the black community, which, faced with racism in every area of their lives, began to resist, seeing assimilation as too great a price to pay, emphasis shifted instead to a philosophy of integration, famously defined by Roy Jenkins in 1966 as, quote, not just a flattening process of assimilation, but equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. As restrictive immigration laws, culminating in the 71 Act which all but halted primary immigration from the new Commonwealth, turned migrants into settlers, what Jenkins's model led to in practice was a host of so-called multicultural policies across various areas. For example, in education, numerous initiatives sought to find ethnic or cultural solutions to the problems of underachievement and racial discrimination. These policies too came under increasing criticism. At worst, they were guilty of what one educationist dubbed the 3S syndrome, the sari, samosa, steel drum approach, which led to the exoticization of minority cultures. This approach fixed the cultures of minority communities as being internally homogeneous and immutable, thereby stereotyping members of these communities. More crucially, it was pointed out that this preoccupation with cultural pluralism evaded the fundamental reason for Black and Asian disadvantage in this society, that reason being racism.